This evening we will be in Luke chapter 12, if you'll open up there. Luke chapter 12. And we'll be looking at the issue of covetousness, which is kind of a big word to start with and a very churchy word, something that you don't really hear outside of the context of talking about it from the Bible. But we'll look at a parable that Jesus tells that certainly is dealing with and even a response to covetousness. But there's another issue that I want to bring into it near the end as well, of another reason that people hold on to stuff sometimes. And so we'll talk about both sides of that. But we'll start like normal, giving a little bit of the context of what we'll look at, talking about the text itself, and then making the applications that we can. But as far as the context goes, we'll really just back up to chapter 12 and in verse 13. It says, "Then one from the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.' But he said to him, 'Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?' And he said to him, 'Take heed, beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses.'" So we start out this story with an individual who comes to Christ asking him to divide an inheritance. Well, first let's put ourselves back into that situation. In all likelihood, the individual who asked this question is Jewish, and so under Jewish law, he is probably, almost definitely, not the oldest brother. Why? Because the oldest brother, as you will remember, receives 2/3 of the inheritance from the father. And not only that, but they also act as the executor as well. And so the older brother's not going to have a problem if that's the situation here. And so who's more likely to come to Jesus? It's probably the younger brother or a younger brother that doesn't think he's getting his fair share of the inheritance from his father. Maybe he thinks the older brother's withholding some of it that he shouldn't be. We don't really know exactly, but he does think it's unfair. And so Jesus responds to him with asking the question, well, who made me a judge or an arbitrator? When he says this, of course, he's not revoking his position as a judge on the whole. Christ will judge all people, but this is a civil matter. This is a family dispute. This is something almost kind of petty even. Christ was not sent to the earth to be a judge in family disputes that are going on. And so actually the word here that's used for arbitrator means divider. And so it's kind of, again, saying, who made me the executor of your father's will? That's not my job. And so he's sending him away with that. But he's going to go farther than that as well. And he gives this warning then in verse 15 to beware of covetousness. So what is covetousness in general? We would probably use a synonym, something like greed, although that probably doesn't quite get to the heart of what covetousness is. It's usually considered more of wanting what someone else has. And so in this case, that's quite literal. The brother's saying, hey, I want more of what I think is due to me. And so he's being covetous. He's certainly being greedy, being selfish, but he's also showing what we're calling covetousness here. Jesus, along with this statement, says that life consists of more than just the stuff that you have. Now, compare that with pretty much anything that the world teaches today. And it seems to be the antithesis to it, right? It's life consists of more than just the abundance of what you have, but that's what all that life is for a lot of people. And of course, from a non-religious viewpoint, it's really all that life is. It's just the abundance of things that you possess, whether that means physically or whether that means intellectually for some. But Jesus says that life is about more than that. And one other thing we'll say is that Jesus could respond to this individual with the law. He's warning him against covetousness, and the law says, thou shalt not covet. So he could just say that and move on, right? But Jesus, as is his manner and is the manner of any good teacher, is going to not just give the command, but he's going to explain the reasons for that command. And so he's not just going to leave him with, don't do it, but here's why you don't do that. And so to explain what he means, he's going to give a parable. And so we're going to examine the parable. It starts in verse 16. It says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plenty. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops?" Just start with that for a second. The ground of a certain rich man yielded plenty. So he has had success in this year's crops. That's great. In fact, there's no condemnation of that. There's nothing wrong with him having success. And Jesus just states that as a fact. And then he asked the question of himself, well, since I have had success, what will I do with my increase? And again, there's not a condemnation there either. In fact, let me suggest all of us have to answer this question, right? What will I do with my increase? Hopefully in your life you won't be such a complete failure that you will never make any profit of any kind. And so we all have to answer this question. Not just the rich man in this story, but what will you do whenever you find yourself with more than you need? Now, his plan then is in verse 18, "I will do this, I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all of my crops and my goods." So we're starting to see the issue, even though I don't think this is necessarily the issue either, because that would condemn a lot of us, wouldn't it? And maybe it does to a certain extent, but when we are looking at just this story, that's not necessarily even the problem, to expand what you are doing and to have more space, even to keep things that you have successfully gained for yourself. But the start of the problem is this, that it all comes back to him. There is a self-centeredness that we can already see in the story. And so if he has an excess, is there somewhere else he could put that excess? And the answer, of course, is yes. It doesn't have to be in his own storehouses, but those things could go to someone else. But still, it is his choice to make. And a lot of times we're quick to condemn people who have a lot, just saying that they could have done this with it. Well, it is their choice to make, but they also should be rich toward God, as we'll see in just a minute. In verse 19, we see the real issue, though. In verse 19, we actually get to hear the inner thoughts of this individual, I suppose as Christ might be able to. And so in verse 19, he says, "I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will these things be which you have provided?" So the real issue that this individual runs into is that he says to himself that I should now be at ease. Why? Because I have provided for myself all the things that I need, and I won't have to do any work after this point. So there's two problems going on there, really. The first problem is he has taken any trust that he should be putting in someone else, which really is in God, and he's saying, I've done it, and I've taken care of myself, and I'm secure now for the future because I've set these things aside. Well, that's not how life works, and of course God is about to show the morbid contrast to this individual that's not going to continue on the way you think it will. And then the second problem, like we said before, is just how self-centered this is. If you read through the words of this rich man, at least when I counted it, I got 13 personal pronouns being used, meaning how many times he says I and mine and my. And so you can see that he's not focused on anybody else, especially not on God, but he's focused on me. And so the real problem, maybe from the start, is a recognition of whose these things that he's talking about are in the first place. And so it says the ground of a certain rich man yielded plenty. He had no room to store his crops, he pulled down his barns. Are any of those things really his from the start? Is it his ground? He might own it legally, but is it his ground? No. Are they really his crops? Did he plant them? Sure. Or had somebody plant them? Who gave the increase, like we've looked at in 1 Corinthians? And is it really even his barns? Sure, he had them built, but all of it belongs to God. It's just a measure of the portion that God has allowed us to borrow for a time. But of course, there's no recognition of that we find from this individual. And so instead, he's going to take his ease, he's going to eat, drink, and be merry. That phrase is used in this verse, and it's very similar to a couple of other occasions, like in Proverbs, I think chapter 1:31, and also 1 Corinthians 15:32, that use that same kind of language, and it's usually not a great thing when that language is used. But, of course, the result of this in verse 20 is that his soul is required of him. The obvious implication, if it's not clear, is that he dies that very night after he has made this plan and has said to himself, I can be at ease, I am secure in all the things that I've done. But the question, and the very chilling question that then is asked is, then whose will these things be? The answer, of course, is not his. But in the context of what we've been looking at, what is it that we're really talking about? Why is Jesus telling this parable in the first place? What he's saying to this younger brother who's desirous of his older brother's inheritance and getting a greater portion of it, Christ says, okay, great. You want that. You desire that. When you die, what difference will that have made? When you die, who will that go to after you? And why are you so covetous of it right now? So, an interesting parallel to this comes in Ecclesiastes. I'll read that text in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and in verse 18. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 18, Solomon kind of predicts this same situation, except he, in his wisdom, recognizes it for his own life, whereas this individual had to have it told to him. Ecclesiastes 2:18, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I have toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Well, Solomon is right. It absolutely is. And you cannot guarantee what will happen with all of those things that you have worked for in life. That's why life does not consist of the abundance of possessions, because ultimately those things are only temporary while you're on earth. But verse 21 tells us the real reason that this is a problem at all. The problem is that he lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. He had a choice, and he wasn't wrong to be successful. He wasn't necessarily wrong to store for the future. There's some wisdom in that. And yet he was rich only toward himself and never toward God. And there is a problem that comes from that. Now, a couple things that we can talk about from this text that are worth mentioning. First, let's just remind ourselves of what Christ is trying to say as far as coveting is concerned. When looking at the idea of coveting, that is, wanting what somebody else has, desiring more all the time, all Jesus really says here is, number one, it isn't yours, and number two, it won't last. Now, if I could think that every time that I wanted something, would I still want it? If I were reminded every time I'm about to make a purchase, every time I hold on to something I don't really need, if I reminded myself, it isn't mine, and it won't last, would I be as likely to make that purchase? Would I be as likely to hold on to whatever that may be? And so that's the simple response to covetousness, is to recognize it's God's, not mine, and it will not last beyond my lifetime, certainly. So that does bring up a question that we've kind of addressed this whole time, which is, what can we do with what God has given to us? And this is actually kind of the counterpoint to the parable, but what the rich fool does, most of it is okay. He plants. What does that mean? Well, that means probably that he has to buy seed, and probably he has to have some way of planting. And we assume on a large scale, since he's able to fill barns, and so he's got to have at least plows, probably servants, probably oxen, the whole works of farming. Nothing wrong with that. You can also make a profit with what God gives to you. There's nothing wrong with that. And you can compare that with the parable of the talents as well. So there's nothing wrong there. And you can also store for the future. And again, there's wisdom in doing that. But there's also a necessity of being rich toward God through the whole process, from the planting to the profiting to the storing up for the future. God has to come first in that. And so the sin doesn't start with any of these individual actions. The sin starts when we over save and we under give toward God and toward those who are in need. Now, like I said, there's another issue that I want to bring in here, because I think it's possible that some of us struggle with coveting. That's certainly possible, especially in different senses. Maybe emotionally we might covet in a way, but when it comes to wealth, maybe not so much, but maybe you do. But there's another angle to this that we'll talk about for just a minute, because the issue of holding on to things that are physical is not always the result of coveting directly. Or maybe this is just another symptom of it. I'll let you decide that. But one reason that people hold on to things, in psychological terms at least, is called compulsive hoarding. You probably know what hoarding is, but generally, if you ever watch a show on it or anything, it gets to the point of ridiculousness as far as how much people possess. But then again, you look at most of our basements and you say, how much of this do I really need as well? But as far as the psychological side goes, this is a diagnosable condition. It's actually recorded at about 2% of the United States population, which is probably not that surprising given how materialistic we are overall. But some of the things that are associated with it are, one, anxiety over needing a certain item in the future. And so most people aren't willing to part with something, not because they just like it or has sentimental value, but because they think, oh, I might need this, or somebody might need this down the road, when that's probably not the case. Another thing, of course, is the inability to part with things. You just hold on to things. That's kind of the whole basis of it, but also a distrust of others handling what you own, what your possessions are. You don't think anybody else will take as good of care of it. And then, of course, probably the most visible symptom is that you live in what's rationally considered an unusable space by most people because of the things that are in it. Again, from the psychological side, just because it's interesting to bring this in, there are different causes that we find for hoarding. Probably the most common is trauma. Now, not maybe in the traditional way that we think of trauma, but for example, childhood poverty is a trauma in this case that can often lead to hoarding, and it kind of makes sense. It's pretty linear to say, okay, if you grew up with nothing, then you might think that you need to hold on to everything. And you can probably think of examples way back into your own family, not that far back, but those who lived through the Great Depression a lot of the time held on to a lot more than maybe we would think necessary. But the reason for that is because there was such scarcity for a time in their life. Similarly, it can be that earlier in life, especially in childhood, that your possessions were disregarded or even destroyed on a regular basis, and that can make you very much cling to the things that you do have. Sometimes it can be the result of other disorders or comorbid with them, like OCD. Wouldn't be surprising to find those together. And then sometimes it's just what your family has done, and so you fall into that same pattern. And there can be other causes as well. But for what we're talking about, whether it's hoarding or whether it's covetousness, it's kind of the same because it's still a hyper focus on the physical. It's a different motivation, but in a lot of ways it's just the same, or it has a similar result at the very least. And of course, those things won't last either, like we've been talking about. Now, on the practical side of that, though, a lot of times we talk about stewardship, which is a good biblical principle, but we usually talk about it in terms of how we spend what we get. And we might even apply that to our time and other things, but most of the time we just think of money. But stewardship also applies to the things that we keep. And that can mean that in what we're talking about right now, it applies to the things that we won't get rid of. Is it good stewardship to hold on to everything? Probably not. Is it rich toward God to hold on to everything? Again, probably not, because some of these things that we hold on to might be useful to somebody else that is in more need than we are. And again, stewardship is not only about what we take in, but it's about what we don't get rid of. If you have a 5,000 square foot house and you can only use 1,000 square feet of it because the rest of it's so full, is that good stewardship? Now, maybe that's not your exact situation, but you understand that whatever the space is, maybe it's just one garage is the case for a lot of people. Is that good stewardship? Or are you at the point of needing to tear down your garage and build a bigger one just to put all of your stuff in? Or the common American problem of the storage unit that never goes away because you didn't build a bigger barn, but you rented one long term. So all that to say that this problem is not necessarily covetousness, but it kind of has the same results as it, and they share a lot of similarities. But again, the same solution would be true to recognize, and Olivia and I try to do this regularly, try to purge the things that we do have. And again, the best thing you can say at the time is, okay, it isn't mine, and it won't last. And when thinking of it in those terms, it's a lot easier to get rid of. But the other thing, and you'll know this if you've ever had to deal with a family member who's died and left a lot behind, that when the question is asked in verse 20, then who will these things be which you have provided? Well, unfortunately, the answer is the family. And a lot of times that's a burden on the family, which is not what you want to do as one of your last acts on earth. So there's plenty of reasons to not hoard, but also not to covet, which can lead to hoarding as well. So these things are pretty closely tied together. Now, to keep this in the context, though, because we've only looked at part of this chapter, this text is not accidentally where it's at. And when Christ continues on in what he's saying here, he spends all this time to give this parable in response to covetousness. And what's the very next thing that he brings up? Well, in verse 22, it says that he said to his disciples, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, nor about the body, and what you will put on." Why did the rich fool in this story say to his soul that he could finally be at ease? Because he had many things stored up for many years. Because he was concerned about this life. Because he was worried about this life. So it's no accident that Jesus maybe repeats the teaching that we see in the Sermon on the Mount about worry here. Because the basis of covetousness sometimes is worry, and the basis of hoarding that we've been talking about is very often anxiety, is very often worry. And he says, do not continue to worry about these things. Let's get down in the chapter to verse 31. And again, we'll see the antidote to both covetousness and hoarding as well. Verse 31, but seek the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added to you. And do not fear, and he refers to them as little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give to you the kingdom. Sell what you have and give alms, and provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches, nor moth destroys. And so instead of focusing on the physical, focus on the eternal, the spiritual kingdom. The spiritual kingdom does not need our stuff. Not to the degree that we tend to hold on to it, at least. Not to the degree that we are wanting what other people have. But stuff is not spiritual. Let me just say that again for effect. Stuff is not spiritual. It just isn't. And when it becomes so much of our life, when the abundance of possessions become life, instead of it being the other way around, then we run into a real issue there. But the issue that underlies all of that most of the time is not enough trust in God. Could God have provided for this younger brother who's trying to get more of the inheritance? He could, if he trusted in him, sure, but he doesn't. Could God have provided for this rich man in this story without him needing to build bigger barns to keep this year's extra great crop? He could have if he trusted in God, but those things weren't allowed to happen. To wrap this up in verse 34, a phrase that hopefully you know well, Christ says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." That word treasure gets used there, same word in English and Greek, gets used in verse 21 at the end of our story, where it says, "So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Well, what Christ says at the end of this text then is that wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart is going to follow. So where was the treasure of this rich man? It was with himself. It was with the physical things that he had possessed in this life. Instead, of course, where should our treasure be? But that's really the question, isn't it? Where is your treasure? Where is your inheritance? As the story started out with that question, where are those things for you? And the answer to that answers also where your heart is. As far as an invitation goes, the invitation's pretty easy because this man thought that he possessed a lot. And what the story emphasizes is that none of it was his, and not only the physical, but not even his own soul, and even his own life was just on loan temporarily from God. We all kind of think to an extent that we possess our life, that we own our life, and yet God will decide when that life ends. And for this individual, it ended that very night. Tonight, that may be the same for you. That may be the same for any of us. The question will be, where is our treasure, and what are we willing to do in response to that? Tonight, if you need to respond to God, hopefully in a positive way, if you need to respond to God's invitation, whether to become a Christian or whether it be some other need from the church, we ask that you come now as we stand and as we sing.